Hey there folks, I'm going to skip the lengthy introduction for this video as we're continuing straight on from the last one. We've been painting with pre-made assets for the whole of the last video, so it's time to get stuck in and make our own. So let's go back to the toolset and create a placeable. Again, like almost everything custom, there is a wizard for it, so you can find the Placeables Wizard in the Wizards menu. Or the way that I usually do it is to navigate to the appropriate palette and then go to custom and right click and select new. We're going to be making a chest for the goblins to store some of their stolen loot in. So I think that fits under the category of containers and switches. Names for things are quite important, so rather than just calling it goblin loot chest, I'm going to put a little creative spin on it and call it, where would goblins store their loot? Battered wooden trunk. Okay, and let's launch the properties dialog. We've already seen this menu earlier on when we looked at our soot stain placeable. Firstly, let's change the appearance out to make it look more like a chest. So we can just scroll down until we find some of the chest models. And I'm going to go for chest 4 because that looks pretty battered and beaten up. We'll see that it's marked static by default. If you remember, static objects are stuff in the background that don't move or do anything. We want the player to be able to interact with this chest, so let's untick the static part. Since we want the player to interact, we should also mark it as usable. And because it is a chest that we're going to put stuff in, it should also have an inventory. We've also got this plot checkbox. This is optional and it's down to your own personal design preference. Now, marking a placeable as plot will make it indestructible. So this means that the player can't simply walk up to the chest, break it open, and take the loot inside. They'll have to either pick the lock, or get the key, or figure out some other way to open the chest. Maybe we can even have a little script that does that. So it's certainly more realistic that the player can simply walk up and bash the chest to bits, but it might lead them to missing out on important aspects of the story. So I'm going to leave this up to you whether you want to add plot armor to this chest or not. I'm going to add some goblin warriors later on to defend the chest, so I'm going to leave it unchecked. Now that the chest is usable, we'll see what we can do with the lock and trap tabs that appear automatically. So let's take a quick look at those. So lock is basically exactly what it says on the tin, and it's actually a surprisingly powerful way of directing the storyline. Our quest objective, the iron ingots, are going to be in this chest. So when the player realizes this, they'll already be deep inside the enemy camp. From then on, a few options appear. So one, the player can get the key to the chest, for example, by killing whoever has it, probably the goblin boss, or stealing it, pickpocketing it, negotiating for it, etc., etc. Or two, the player should figure out how to open the chest without the key, for example, picking the lock, using the spell, or bashing the chest apart if it doesn't have plot enabled. So this is a really good move for our story in general. It allows for the possibility of solving the same problem in several different ways. More importantly, it allows different types of players to overcome this challenge in a way that fits their character most. The angry barbarian might go on a killing spree, chopping up all the nearby goblins until the key is found. A bard might try to trick the goblins into handing over the key. With this one barrier, we can create a number of implicit secondary objectives. The rogue might want to pick the lock, but needs to find a thieves' tools kit first. The wizard might not know the spell knock or have it prepared, but if they find a scroll that has that spell, then they'll be able to open the chest that way. The fighter might not be powerful enough to kill the goblin chieftain who holds the key, so we'll need to go away and train before taking him on, and so on. Situations like this allow the player to create the game in their own head, find new motivations, and try to figure out the puzzle. How do I get this chest open? This makes for a much more compelling story than simply guiding the player from quest giver A to quest giver B. With that said, let's set this chest up. We want it to be locked, of course, but we don't particularly care about relocking it. The goal of the quest is to get at what's inside the chest. So once it's actually unlocked, it becomes irrelevant to our storyline. We're not going to say the key is required to open the chest. If this box is ticked, it can only be opened with the key. We want the players to be able to lockpick it or open it in other ways, but we're going to set the DC quite high. DC, if you're unfamiliar, just stands for difficulty class. This is the lower threshold the player needs to succeed on in order to accomplish the task. Difficulty for something like this is measured by the player rolling a 20-sided die, D20, and then adding the appropriate skill modifier. In this case, it's the open lock skill. If that combined total beats the difficulty class of the lock, then it opens. So let's call the DC something like 17 here because we want it to be quite challenging. Obviously, a rogue might already have 3 or 4 points in picking the lock, so they'll need to roll 13 or higher to succeed on that, which is still about a 65% chance of failure. Cool. Okay, so we've got that, and then we can look at traps. So after going on this positive rant about how awesome locks are, you're probably thinking I'm going to say the same thing about traps. Unfortunately, that is not the case here, at least not in this version of D&D. Most recent versions of the game have opened up traps to be a lot more versatile. Unfortunately, here we're using the old 3rd edition rules, which means that the only people who can really disarm traps are rogues and maybe bards. For everyone else, it makes very little sense to invest any points in the disarm trap skill. What this means, therefore, is that our design here needs to be based on a mechanical constraint. If there's a good chance of having a rogue in the party, either an NPC companion or a player in a multiplayer setting, then I think traps are almost a necessity. A great part of the value of having a rogue in your party in 3rd edition is precisely for opening locks and disarming traps, and you can make all the players feel more engaged with the narrative by having the rogue scout ahead for these exact obstacles. However, since we are only doing a single player module here with no NPC companions for now, there is a very low probability that our only party member, the player, will be a rogue. Therefore, placing a trap here they have no hope of disarming is probably a poor design decision. Finally, we do want a key item as well. Only about half the classes will actually be able to pick the lock, rogues, obviously, and some of the arcane classes will have access to a spell called Knock. Every class will have the opportunity to bash the chest open if they want to, but we will also want to accommodate the non-violent solution. So our player should have the option to find a key. So let's make that key item now. To do that, we need to jump over to the Paint Items tab, head over to Custom, and right-click and select New. Alternatively, as always, you can use a wizard under the Wizards menu or by pressing Ctrl-Alt-I. There are a lot of item types here, including weapons, armors, potions, and much more. I'm going to take a more detailed look at those in another video. For this, we're going to just select the key type. There's not much else here. We can't make the key magical, so all we have to do is give it a name and press finish. So once we've done that, let's launch the item properties as well to go through what we need. Firstly, we will need to tag the key. This is important as this exact tag is going to be specified within the properties of the chest later on, just so that we can link the chest and the key together. As always, remember that capitalization, spaces, etc. are vital for this, so do remember how you spell this particular tag. Once that's done, we can move over to the Appearance tab. This one is pretty self-explanatory. We can play around with the various options until we find something that we like. Properties tab, we won't add any additional properties here, but this is the place to customize your item. We will be doing some work later on with custom armors and weapons, where we will be looking at this menu more closely. For now, we should just be aware that this is where most of the modifications for the way an item functions will take place, including any custom scripts that we might want to add. One thing to make sure is that the undroppable undroppable checkbox is off here. So this key will be held by the Goblin Chief originally, and we want them to be able to drop it on death or via pickpocketing. You'll also see the identifiable box should be grayed out and automatically checked. In case anyone isn't aware of how identification works, let me do a quick digression on this because this system will become quite important later on. So almost every basic item you acquire, if it's a key, a weapon, or a piece of armor, will be identified by default. However, items that have some sort of magical property or unique ability might enter the player's inventory as an unidentified item. They will know that this is some sort of magical ring or weapon, but they will not be able to use it or see its abilities until it has been identified. In the base game, this is done by merchants, or it can be done by characters using the lore skill. Identifying the item successfully reveals its uses, abilities, true name, and description. So, what this means in practice for us is that each magical item that we make can have two states, unidentified and identified. We'll see this in the next tab, description. This will be the description shown when the player inspects the item in their inventory. Since our key has no magical properties and therefore is automatically identified, we only need to fill in the identified description here. When we move on to make more complex items, I'll talk a little bit about how to make these two descriptions sufficiently different to be interesting for the player. So that should be our key done. We're going to go through this process again to make one other item, and this will be the actual quest item that the player is after. So basically, let's repeat the item creation process. Go back into the wizard. For type this time, we're going to choose miscellaneous medium, and we can call it iron ingots. Because this is a quest item, we can add it to the plot items section, and then we can go over to properties. In the appearance tab, let's choose something to represent the item. Again, these icons will be different depending on which version of the base game you have, but let's choose something roughly resembling our prize. I like this mystery sack of stuff, but you can choose the metal bars, for example. In the properties tab, let's add one custom item property, and that's going to be a weight increase. By default, this item weighs just half a pound, which seems a little bit unrealistic, given that it's supposed to be a sack of metal bars. So I'm going to add another 30 pounds of weight to it here. Since the item now has custom properties, you will see that the identified checkbox becomes available. Since we want the player to know exactly what this is straight away, we can make sure that that checkbox is ticked and continue. And we just need a quick description for the item. So let's put in something like a sack of iron ingots stolen by the goblins from the merchant. Good. So this one is done. Now we can go for the final bit of putting it all together. So let's go back to Placeables and spawn our custom chest into the world. This works in exactly the same way as normal Placeables do. We can just select it from our menu here and spawn it down somewhere in the camp. Once we've placed it in, we can take a look at the properties of this particular object. It should have the Has Inventory checkbox enabled. If not, we should enable it here and then navigate over to the actual inventory itself and add our ingots into the chest like so. One quick other thing to do here is we'll go back to the lock tab and we'll just add the tag from the key into the key required to unlock. So one last thing to do is to just test out that this is all working correctly. Let's navigate back over to the Items tab and grab our Goblin Chief's key and pop it on the ground here. And let's also move the player spawn just for this test to be quite close to the chest. And then we can build and test as always. Now that we're loaded in, we should see a few things. Approaching the chest normally will tell us that it is locked, which is exactly what we want. We can also take a look to see if the lock picking prompt is here. If the character is a rogue, they would be able to use this to try and unlock it. Unfortunately, my test character is a paladin, so success will never be possible, and that's fine. If you want to go more detailed in your testing, you can also make a rogue and spawn some thieves tools. See how many tries it takes for you to open the chest, but I think we can skip that for now. Let's then pick up the key, open the inventory with the hotkey I, and if we examine that, we should see our key's identified description right there. So that's good. Now that we have the key, let's try to open the chest again, and that should work correctly. If this part doesn't work, go back to your chest and check that the tag of the key matches the tag in the lock section of your chest. So if this does work, we should be able to open it and examine the iron ingots inside. Again, you can see the description here, so that's all worked correctly. So there we have it. We have a custom chest that can be unlocked with a custom key and holding a custom quest item within it. So I think this is a good place to be wrapping this one up. So this video wasn't too heavy on the engine concept, but I think the point that I'd like you to take away from this is largely thinking about encounter design. So good RPGs are at their core largely about creative problem solving, and our locked chest is an interesting example of a very basic problem that the player has to solve. What we'd like to do is think up as many interesting ways as we can for the player to address the problem of how do I open this chest? And this philosophy is something that we generally want to apply to most other encounters, be they with inanimate objects, NPCs, or even other players. Typically, we want at least two ways for any type of player, regardless of their class, race, or other specifics, to resolve the encounter. Here, we've achieved this by providing an option to bash the chest open, which any player can do, or acquire the key from the Goblin Chief. Specific classes will also have alternate options, lock picking using magic to open the chest. Um, yeah, so lots of different ways of doing it. Obviously, you could add more yourself as well. Think about um, maybe there's more than one copy of the key. So another NPC that you could go talk to would have a secondary copy, so you don't have to confront the chief. There's a ton of different ways that you can further enhance this situation, but I think this is a good start. So in the next video, we're going to have a look at actually populating our goblin camp. We'll work a little bit more with the creature editor, as well as take a look at factions and how we can affect players' reputation with those factions. So as always, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you again soon.